Good morning and welcome everybody. Today is the fourth lecture of online lecture series on social linguistics delivered by Professor Shobha Satyanath. The topic of the fourth lecture is parameters of variation. Dr. Shobha Satyanath, from former professor and head of the Department of Linguistics, University of Delhi, had graduated from University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, USA in 1991. Professor Shobha Satyanath is a leading social linguist of India and had done intensive research on the various aspects of social linguistics with special reference to Indian situation. She has done extensive study in social linguistics of multilingual, multicultural communities of India. Her research has also focused on the outcomes of urban mobility and conduct in multi-ethnic, multilingual, multidialectal settings, which has produced findings that are often at odds with the ones that have come from the Western social linguistic settings. Professor Shobha Satyanath has published in well-known social-linguist journals such as Journal of Social Linguistics, Journal of Asia-Pacific Language Variation, and Journal of Language Contact, etc. She is the chief editor of the journal called Asia-Pacific Language Variation, published by John Benjamin. She is also a member of a streaming committee of International Conference Series. I am inviting Professor Shobha Satyanath to deliver her lecture. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. I would like to begin with a quick recap of the last three talks. But before I do that, I would like to invite any comments from the audience. Of course, we'll take it up at the end. But if there is something, you're most welcome to come up now, and I'll make a note of it. Some people may have comments, but they are reluctant to ask at the end. So I'm asking if you have been thinking about it and if there are any comments. Not yet. You're also welcome to type it in the chat box if you like. Okay. All right. So allow me screen sharing. Share screen. Yeah. Please allow me screen sharing.
Now we can start.
I'll do that. It's still not letting me share my screen, please.
Just a minute.
Not yet able to. Oh, okay. I can do that now. Okay. I guess you can see my screen now. Am I right?
Yeah.
Okay. Just put it on. Right. So you can see my full screen.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So today I would be focusing on or talking about parameters of variation. Right. And before I do that, there are people who are waiting. Admit. Okay. I have a problem when I let people enter in that that screen doesn't go away from here. Okay. All right. So first, a quick recap of the last three talks before we move on to this one. The first talk, I focused on what social linguistics is all about, and I listed out its various fundamental assumptions and discussed each one of them. So basically what social linguistics is that it brings together various separated ways of inquiring into language. It considers both language and grammar as multifactorial. Its methodology stems from its assumptions, and better generalizations emerge from empirical research, and such findings are testable. Their application across variety of settings leads to expansion of the knowledge and growth of the field. In the second talk, I provided an overview of Western social linguistics, touching upon the key developments and findings, such as style, social meaning, that languages index, outcomes of the forces of transmission and diffusion, and both result in greater diversity through change, though diffusion causes much more rapid change. The third talk, which was titled Social Linguistics in India, it's important to note that when dealing with humans, human settlements, and languages, there are differences across linguistic ecologies and their social cultural structures. To assume that one model in its entirety will work everywhere is not tenable. Any research, therefore, requires that we think globally but act locally. Accordingly, I chose two Dravidian, one Indo-Aryan, one Tibeto-Burman, and two Indo-Aryan Tibeto-Burman context settings from across India. The examples of variation that I discussed touched upon syntactic, lexical, and phonological aspects of variation. I did that deliberately because there is a common perception, or rather misperception, that social linguistics only deals with phonology, which is not the case. So through these examples, I highlighted the importance of factors such as urbanization, mobility, and other factors contributing to contact and change. Also, I brought up one example of variation in a stable setting from Kerala. So these examples together touched upon various social parameters also, such as caste, clan, gender and matriarchy, language in a bilingual context. And also I talked about variation in Vishnupriya, which has been involved, or which has a history, significant history of a conflict movement. Today, I'll draw upon examples not only from India, but also from across the subcontinent. And the focus of my talk is on parameters of variation with a focus on standardness. So usually when we think of social linguistics, we think of social parameters. This is because the label social linguistics implies connections between language and society. However, as we will see, there is no straightforward relationship between the two, nor does a social parameter work similarly everywhere. So one of the important parameters in social linguistics research has been standardness. The idea of standardness is deeply embedded into social linguistics theory of variation and change. The models of diversity proposed by Ferguson and Fishman, which have been wholeheartedly embraced across the subcontinent, also draw upon this, though it's never talked about. Though standardness has been central to linguistics as a whole, it is only recently that new dialogues are emerging on the role of standardness from within social linguistics. A major motivating factor behind this is the expanding research base of social linguistics research across Asia Pacific. It's not that people have never addressed the issue of standardness before this, they have, but not in the manner, the way it's happening now. So, right. So therefore, we begin by asking, where do standards come from? Well, one simple answer is standards emerge when a language adopts writing and produces a literary canon. It seems now that this is not a sufficient condition by itself. With the widening of the concept of literature, we know and acknowledge that oral compositions and their oral circulation have long preceded their writing across the subcontinent. and more languages entered the literary canon over time, in the case of India. Not realizing this complicated the understanding of periodization of early Indo-Aryan and the relationship between Sanskrit and Prakrits. Likewise, trying to understand the subcontinent through the lens of Western monolingual nationalism complicated, to say the least, the understanding of relations among language families in India. The other components of standardization may include, more people coming in late. Okay. The other components of standardization may include, for instance, the official role of the written form, its role as a repository of knowledge of consequence, whether constitutional, legal, and administrative, even religious, medicinal, etc. Language of education, in which new knowledge is created, pursued, updated, and stored. Production of linguistic resources, such as prescriptive grammar writing, dictionary production, lexicon, etc., etc. Even if most of these conditions are met, and even if we try to project the written spoken forms on a parameter of standardness, they still do not compare well with the standards in the Western context, not even those languages having a much longer history of literary tradition and grammar writing and compilation of lexicon. While these criteria, okay, I'll just skip this one. Yeah. Okay, so these criteria can, some more people, sorry for that. Okay, these criteria can only give us dichotomies of sorts. Some of the dichotomies we find are listed here. For instance, you find that in some settings, and with reference to a few traits, there is perhaps a clear opposition between the two. But as you go down the list, you are likely to come across settings where such traits are not a matter of either or. Besides, even if a language fulfills the top 4 functions, it is no guarantee that it will produce a standard, non-standard opposition of consequence. So the question is both where do standards come from, but also how and what kind of significance and social meanings they produce. We often tend to assign higher value to the traits on the left side of the table and the languages and varieties that have these. There is also a tendency to believe that languages with the traits on the left have greater vitality, or by acquiring those will ensure the long-term survival of a language. A language of employment need not be the official language. This has happened in Sri Lanka, where when the nation switched from a 2-language policy to a Sinhala alone language policy, English unofficially flourished as the corporate world offered employment to youth who knew English. So only the government-run schools came under the preview of the new education policy, whereas the private schools just went scot-free. So there is no guarantee that a so-called officially anointed language will have greater prestige in public perception, and the non-standard ones will be evaluated negatively. It has happened in Bhutan and Nepal, also happening in India. Likewise, there is no guarantee that a non-standard pronunciation would be judged negatively over the standard one, or that standard one would be perceived as more correct over the other. The above, nonetheless, does hold true in the Western scenario. The question is why. Therefore, the question, where do standards come from? So the question is, how does it affect its relationship with other forms of languages and other languages and their perception? A look at the timeline of history of writing across Asia will tell you that a great majority of the languages did not enter writing substantially until 1500. This is despite the fact that the history of writing and grammar itself is very old in the region. A literary spoken forms or divide forms have existed throughout the history. As for India, many languages entered writing around 1500 and after. Colonization, the advent of printing press, Bible translations, modern public education seem to have played an important role in more and more languages entering into writing. A written form, its circulation, how long it has existed, its importance as a source of knowledge play a role in such language forms being used for developing or coining new terminology to accommodate new technology. This has happened throughout the history. Revenue and judiciary-related terms in India, for instance, have largely come from Persian and English. What happens in a multilingual ecology when multiple languages have writing and official role? What kind of relationship is assumed between languages and language forms in such circumstances? While there is no conformity over what a standard language is and what the traits are of its speakers and the language itself, there is a unique property associated with the standardness in the Western context, which is high and low. Standard languages of the Western nations are an outcome of the very rise of modern nation states and their monocultural ideologies of one language and one race or population. This is regardless of the diversity that such nations held at that time and continue to hold. The rise of the national languages, backed by this nationalistic monocultural ideology, its dissemination through education, etc., are responsible for giving rise to the powerful normative standard languages and the idea of standardness. This also gave rise to an asymmetric social relationship between the standard and the rest of the diversity by reducing it to non-standard. These attitudes are too often extended to their speakers as well. However, beyond the West, there is no reason to believe that this association is universal or the most prevalent, as you will see. It is the Western influence, its power being the center of knowledge production, that influenced both the scholarly and the general public perceptions worldwide about relationships among languages in a diverse setting. This, however, did not influence our evaluations and judgments, as has been revealed through various subject reaction tests in social linguistics research. So this model, which is a modification, minor modification of Trudgill's model, which he proposed in '83, it captures the Western experience. It shows the dichotomy of standard versus non-standard, their association with socioeconomic hierarchy, and evaluation of standardness of a variant in terms of high or low. It is this social evaluation which produces social meaning, as evident in class style shift, social stratification, and is revealed through perception tasks, etc. On this slide, I have drawn both the vertical and the horizontal relations. The vertical dimension reflects the Western hierarchical model, and the multicultural model, some more people joining, okay. Okay, so vertical dimension here reflects the Western hierarchical model that I just showed you, whereas the multicultural model shows the relations shows that the relations between languages are horizontal. What this implies is that there is an absence of high and low, or positive or negative evaluation, as evident in the case of West. The models have not so much to do with the degree of diversity. Rather, these are the outcomes of two different ideologies. One is monocultural and the other multicultural. It can be said that in the case of New South Asia, despite the changes in the political geographies, the pre-colonial multicultural sensibilities have not disappeared. It remains to be seen whether the boundaries have hardened or not, but at least this is what my research shows. So this is a rough sketch of how I visualize the relations among languages in India by placing the community languages at the center rather than at the periphery. It may still look like administratively hierarchical model, but it's not. The diversity of India prompted the new Indian nation states to recognize multiple official languages for its constituent states and union territory. This is not entirely true because before that, language mapping had already taken place, as evident in Grierson's Survey of India, which sort of fueled language identities. So it's not as benign a demand as we tend to think. Okay, so the diversity of India prompted us to talk about resulted in reorganization of states in terms of sameness of language and culture. And this was a deviation from the widely followed European model of linking one language to one nation state, but also in a way an adaptation of the same, though embedded in a federal structure. So there are more than 1,500 mother tongues, let's say, grouped under some 122 languages from 4 language families spread over some 36 states and union territories. In this horizontal model of diversity, the numerous community languages serve a variety of social functions and are often tied with the local economies. Thus, a Marwari trader, for instance, speaks the local community language Kokborak. Knowing state language Bengali alone may not be enough for him to do this business. Of course, now Kokborak is also recognized by Tripura, but it had not been the case up until recently. This is another way of drawing it. So I call it a non-polyglossic model of horizontal societies of India, where the community languages have been placed at the center. And I have placed other languages also horizontally. So these are placed at the center as these hold the communities together. Someone else wanted to join. I don't know what happened. Okay. Various languages serve various social functions and are tied up with different layers of economy, as I just mentioned. Together, these contribute to the verbal repertoire and sources for identities. So people are bilingual in languages at various levels. How much time we have? Okay, we still have 8 minutes, so we can continue. Please remember, if the system logs us out, then we have to log in back again. Okay, so when Ferguson came up with the notion of diglossia as a model to account for bilingualism and or the use of 2 related varieties, he was thinking in terms of literary and spoken, formal and casual, or home public domains, where these different languages serve different functions. More importantly, he was thinking in terms of high and low, referring to the relative prestige, functions, domains of use, etc., of the 2 languages. For instance, the high variety in the context of Arabic refers to classical Arabic. In the case of German, it referred to standard German and standard French in the case of Haitian Creole. It doesn't come as a surprise. It doesn't come as a surprise that both diglossia and standardness have their roots in the Western nationalism. While differentiating or identifying the spoken and the literary versions is understandable, the model goes wrong when it comes to their interpretation as vertical. It seems far more suitable for the Western context than for the South Asian or Indian context. While such concepts were widely applied by the local and South Asian scholarship for, let's say, Bengali and Dravidian in terms of literary and spoken, some of the local scholarships also contested these. Sinhala has been reported to have an opposition between a classical literary variety and a spoken variety. I've placed some references here. Apart from lexical differences, syntactic differences have also been reported between the 2 varieties. Following Ferguson, the concept of diglossia is often used by Western scholars to describe Sinhala. However, much of the local scholarship contested this notion, as I said. It has been suggested that in addition to the classical literary variety, there is a new standard variety, which draws upon more synchronic resources. It therefore bridges the gap between the 2 varieties and is more flexible, as it can be used in both formal and colloquial contexts to varying degrees. The same has been pointed out more recently for Arabic by Nilofer Harry. More importantly, the varieties that form Sinhala diglossia are difficult to interpret in terms of high and low in the strict Fergusonian sense. There is no correlation between the use of high variety and one's social ranking, and therefore requiring the use of high variety. The concept of prestige in Sinhala is also not a social stratificational one. This is one of the most insightful and earliest observations on South Asia. This is in line with the research reported on Malayalam and for several Indian settings that have been studied and observed, and as reported in my study of 2015. Furthermore, the Sinhala situation cannot be viewed just from the synchronic lens. It needs to be viewed in the context of a social historiography of the pre-colonial period on the one hand, and of the post-colonial period, the rise of Sinhala nationalism, which led to the resurrection of a new high variety on the other. Sinhala social linguistics research needs to focus on observations of verbal performance in a variety of everyday context to produce a better understanding of the variation at play in the use of Sinhala. Further, a deeper investigation into the classical literary Sinhala may provide fresh insights into the context in which Sinhala and other Indian Ocean, Indo-Aryan, Dravidian contact varieties developed and their antiquity. This is necessary as its history, as constructed, is largely utopian and is deeply rooted in Sinhala nationalism, which has ideologized Sinhala race, Sinhala language, and Sinhala nation. For example, see Field 2017. Okay. The finding that two varieties are not evaluated as high and low in terms of overt prestige also makes the Sinhala situation unlike the standard non-standard divide of the Western context. De Silva was a contemporary of Prabodh Pandit, and the two have provided valuable insights into South Asia on the relations among languages in the context of bilingualism and diglossia. These insights refute the simplistic observations made by some of the Western scholars. Gumfors too modified his position on bilingualism and caste following Pandit's landmark studies on Zoroastrians in Gujarat and caste in Gujarat. The point that De Silva was making was that regardless of the divide that may exist between a literary and spoken, the relationships between the two are not interpretable in terms of prestige, social ranking, and therefore high and low. This audience is guided to a paper of mine which appeared in 2022. This is the point that I'm trying to make here. I think we would log out here. There are 2.3 minutes left and then log in again. Is that okay? Because it's 11. So please remember to join as quickly as you can. Thank you. So let's log out and log back again. So welcome back. I'll begin as soon as I'm allowed to share my screen, which will take probably a few minutes for the host to allow me. Yeah, please remember to enable screen sharing. Okay, I guess we can do that now. Right. View, admit all. I understand you are all able to see my screen, right? Okay, so shall we start? Are you able to hear me and see my screen?
Yes, yes.
So moving on to Fishman's model of bilingualism. Fishman's model of bilingualism and separation of role division is hardly in sync with the multicultural realities of the world. While one can adopt this meaningfully as part of the larger methodology, but to use this as a standalone measure and blindly extend it to understand the relations between languages and their vitality does not work. I draw upon an example of Bangladeshi diaspora in UK. We ask, how does one study a local speech variety which coexists with a more standardized variety among the Bengali diaspora in UK? Bengali or Bangla is an umbrella term which subsumes all varieties of Bangla. It may also be used to exclude them in favor of the officially recognized and written standard Bangla. The study uses a term Sylheti, unfortunately, to collectively refer to the Eastern Bengali. In reality, there exist several Dalek regions across Eastern Delta, covering both of Assam and Bangladesh. Some people also find the term pejorative. This also reflects a macro view as a discrete entity. Disregarding this, I have chosen to more people enter. Okay. Sorry for this small distraction. Yeah. So disregarding this fact, I've chosen this study as it is valuable and valid in Indian context too. It is common among Dalek speakers of Hindi to routinely identify themselves with the state language Hindi. The reasons are not low prestige of the Dalek, but that the speakers do not perceive them as distinct unless specifically pointed out by an insider. So a common response of anyone, for example, in Madhya Pradesh or any other Hindi state, when asked what is the local language spoken here, a flat answer is Hindi. I experienced this in several locations, and in the recent past, on a visit to Madhya Pradesh, Pachmadi, a few years back, the driver, while constantly conversing in one of the local dialects, insisted that he was speaking in Hindi. So coming back to this study of which I'm right. There is some noise in the background, please. Would you please mute yourself? Please mute yourself. There's still noise. Would you please mute yourself? Okay. So this study is valuable both in its finding and its methodology and approach. It suggests that while studying a local variety which coexists with a more standard form and a more widely known label such as Bangla or Bengali, it is important to know that speakers may not always correctly identify themselves. In this case, people overwhelmingly identified themselves as Sylheti, but also as Bengali, which they did not speak. Therefore, to separate the identity of Bangla from that of Sylheti, the study encouraged respondents to think in terms of two different languages, one Sylheti and the other Bangla. Furthermore, the reported behavior was validated by actual observed behavior to judge the mismatch between the two, if any. The study also identified differences between the languages used in the mother tongue network, which will trigger the use of vernacular, as opposed to the friendship or other networks. This is a significant finding in terms of methodology. While friendship networks might seem sufficient to observe more casual speech more generally, these might also be grossly inadequate to observe totality of verbal repertoire in multicultural settings. in this particular case and similar cases elsewhere, to observe or trigger the use of ancestral dialects, which may not show up everywhere and every time. One needs to know the networks where such use can be observed. This at times leads to erroneous and incomplete observations in multicultural contexts if one is not careful. The study also observed the use of both Sylheti and English in the family and friendship domains. Following Fishman would lead us to suspect this as a sign of loss of vitality because of the presence of English would be seen as a threat to Sylheti. The findings instead suggest that the use of Sylheti and English in the family and friendship domains are indicative of language maintenance with additive stable bilingualism, which is contrary to Fishman. Furthermore, despite Sylheti has no prestige status or institutional support, it has more vitality than Bangla in the context of migrants in the UK and is maintained by adults and students. Use of English in the family domain, along with other languages, also challenges the social hierarchy that such models seem to suggest. These results are akin to diglossia and standardness because the relationships among languages are seen as asymmetrical. Once again, Fishman's model of bilingualism too is embedded in a monocultural ideology. Both Fishman and Ferguson have been extended to language vitality research. Even though not explicitly acknowledged, diversity is seen as a contra to language vitality, which reminds us of early negative views on bilingualism. For instance, multiplication of home domain by several languages is often considered as a threat to the vitality of language. Starting in the 1980s, a number of studies were carried out on the migrant communities in Delhi. Relying heavily on Fishman and reported behavior, multiplication of languages in home domain in several of them was interpreted as a sign of threat to the migrant community's language. However, a study of the Malayali community carried out by Michael, 2015, more than 13 years later, reported multiplication in every domain across 3 generations with no sign of loss of Malayalam. There is an expansion of verbal repertoire, and whenever an interlocutor knows Malayalam, it is used alongside other languages. In a plurilingual setup, it is normal for speakers to draw upon totality of linguistic resources available to them. It is important to note that change is not attrition. While this was not the primary objective of the study, it's an additional finding that emerges. Ferguson's and Fishman's understanding of languages in terms of high and low became deeply established across social linguistics and linguistics at large, where language relations increasingly came to be seen in terms of power, dominance, and prestige, leading to unequal relations. This influenced research on bilingualism and the subsequent research on vitality, which is also embedded in this power and dominance discourses. So this is the table where you could see the use of multiple languages. And interestingly, you find that even the migrant speaker here, right, woman, she doesn't use Malayalam with her colleagues and classmates and domestic help. So obviously people who don't know Malayalam, she uses the other languages. But everywhere else, you see that there is a multiplication in the subsequent generation. So when she speaks to her child, she brings 3 languages together. So does father, right? And so, of course, does child when speaking to parents, right? And siblings. But you can see, and also it's happening when speaking to relatives in Kerala, etc., etc. Okay. Question arises, if prestige is such an important parameter, then why low prestige vernaculars have not vanished from the earth? Well, they haven't. Even in the United States, vernaculars are getting stronger or have become stronger over time. Vernaculars are a source of community, family, everyday socialization, and belonging. It is these identities that can be easily weaponized and are being increasingly weaponized across Asia and Africa. It is important to note that language-based identities did not exist in India until the LSI mapped our linguistic diversity and categorized us using language. It was the regions and perhaps communities that served as sources of identity. A usual question was, where are you from? Likewise, caste and religion too have been weaponized by their mapping and misreading by the British as hierarchical. The other terms include tribe. More innovative uses are often reported by politicians. Apart from being motivated and mischievous, these purposely echo Western models and distort the understanding of diversity for vote banks. The recent examples include Hindu versus Dalit, and a more recent one, Adipurush, equating the tribal with Aborigine. This is not a term that applies to us, it applies to the settler colonies, such as North America, Australia, and New Zealand. What happens when we research Englishes in non-Western contexts? Does the term standardness apply to the New World Englishes? Given the social significance of the concept of standardness in Western context, it is common in Western social linguistics to identify variants in terms of standardness. However, the same Western nationalist ideology may not be at work in non-Western context, and therefore such a distinction may not be very useful when researching Englishes in non-Western context. Among the examples of diglossia reported in Ferguson is Haitian Creole. The terms pidgins and Creoles themselves are an outcome of similar monocultural nationalist ideologies where race is an important component. Decades of research on New World Englishes, by measuring them using the Western Standard English norms, have only complicated understanding of their historical development and have projected them as non-standard, non-native, L2 deficient Englishes. I bring three examples, one from India and one each from Guyana and Jamaica, to show the futility of standardness in this context. Bhattacharya 2017 carried out a study on S-affix voicing in three morphological and one phonological context. So such as plurals, possessive, and third singular, and also stem internally in one phonological context. In English spoken in urban North Delhi, the S voicing is commonly known to be conditioned by the voicing feature of the noun or verb stem final segment preceding the S affix in Western Englishes. Violation of this normative rule have also been reported for American English in a handful of studies recently. The data was gathered by Bhattacharya from speakers in the age group of 25 to 30 years, all postgraduates, and known to use English beyond institutional domains and with comparable education and competence in English. The data was tested for 6 phonological and 7 social factors. Overall, the findings suggest presence of very little voicing. As opposed to the normative S voicing, the voicing in Delhi English is constrained by factors other than the features of the preceding stem final segment. It instead varies because of the following segment type. Further, S voicing turned out to be independent of social factors, and that the shift in Delhi English is internally motivated. It presents a divergence rather than a deficient model of English. Here are the two visual representations that the study provides, and you could see in this phrase jams and jellies. In the first one, so it could be pronounced as both with the voiceless sirs, both with voiced or one voiced and one voiceless, right? So here you find both jams and jellies are pronounced without voicing. And in the bottom one, if you see, you could see presence of voicing here, right? Very clearly. So the speakers produce sir, sir, zar, but also sir, in such phrases. On this graph, first thing we notice is that there is an absence of style shift, as voicing is the lowest in word list, which is supposed to be the most maximally careful speech style. The differences across reading tasks then is not an outcome of attention paid to speech. Interestingly, or instead, the greater voicing in larger contexts is due to the availability of both the preceding and the following context. So the answer to why do words have lower probability of S voicing is clear. It can be argued that words spoken in isolation do not provide another person, yeah. They do not provide an access to a following context. In contrast, phrases, sentences, passages, and spontaneous speech provides access to the following context, occurring across word boundary. Further, spontaneous speech provides the best connected speech and uninterrupted access to the following context, facilitating greater S voicing. The results further affirm the role of the following context. It is possible that the data for the available descriptions of voicing of Sir in the earlier studies, Introduction to Linguistics, right, are possibly based on words considered in isolation or on their own perception. I say words in isolation because that is where the morphophonemic processes are seen as applying at the morpheme boundary. It is not known whether the following context is relevant for the allomorph voicing in ENLs. The present finding could not have been discovered had the study relied on words alone, which have very little effect on voicing. And as some of you might know, that one of the focus of social linguistics is to model grammar using spontaneous speech data, which sort of broadens the very nature of data itself and bring in much greater accountability and also allows us to model a speech community. Okay, so moving on to the social meaning of S, the study further conducted 2 perception tasks, which included 1 self-evaluation task and 1 correctness task on 8 speakers to assess if there is any social meaning attached to the SIRS or variants and whether there is any influence of the external norm. The study focused on plurals occurring in isolation and plurals embedded in sentences and phrases. So a total of 38 speech samples were played to 8 judges, aged 25 to 30 years, and those who were all born and brought up in Delhi. And a total of 38 speech excerpts were played to 8 judges, right? And to understand how they assess these things. So for self-evaluation tasks, the judges were asked to evaluate how closely a given speech sample they heard matched their own pronunciation on an evaluation scale ranging from my pronunciation to not at all my pronunciation. For the correctness task, the same set of judges were asked to evaluate the same speech samples, though randomized in a different order, on a scale of correctness ranging correct to not correct, to not at all acceptable. The study did not find any preferential rating for one variant over the other on any of the tasks. The 2 variants were judged equally good and acceptable, with no signs of showing negative or positive evaluation of the 2 variants. The absence of social meaning attached to the SIRS-er alternation suggests that the notion of standardness as perceived in the Western context is not at work in English in Indian context. It is not that the Indian speakers are not aware of the grammar rule, which is taught in school, but that it is not of any social consequence. The overwhelming presence of SIR at the production level in the study is an outcome of the internal constraints operating below the level of consciousness. Now, somebody might argue that actually in American English too, when people are using vernacular, they may not produce enough voicing, right? But the point is that it will still carry a social meaning, which is not the case in English elsewhere. So the findings once again underscore absence of a vertical model and presence of a horizontal model at work, where relations among variants and varieties are not perceived in terms of prestige, status, or power. These concepts have long been articulated in early research on English in India. For a long time, English in India has been researched as an elite language, which is at odds with the history of growth of English in India. Now I move on to English in Guyana, and we are looking at the Indian diaspora again. For those who are less familiar with the field of Creole so-called studies, English was brought into Guyana during the 17th and 18th centuries as a direct result of European expansionism. Guyana has its roots both in slavery and indentured labor, a large proportion of which originated in India. Today, Guyana is a monolingual English-speaking multicultural country, though a Bhojpuri-based coin has survived for several generations. The cultural practices haven't disappeared, they linger on. The cultural hybridity of Guyana and similar societies attracted anthropologists as well as linguists, a majority of whom were English teachers. English spoken in Guyana has long been described as comprising multiple varieties which arise because of the differences in English competence of its speakers. Such attitudes have given rise to terms such as pidgins, creoles, and decreolization to capture the local linguistic situation. It was also believed that for the same reason, widely used social linguistic models cannot be applied or could not be applied to Guyana and similar places elsewhere with shared history. Such models are in line with the monocultural and racial orientation of the Western monoculturalism and the local scholars who followed them. And these models dominated the study of New World Englishes worldwide. Guyana has been extensively studied using such models. However, my own research shows otherwise. There are three broad varieties that the Guyanese themselves have come to identify. Also because these terms have been fed to them. So they identify Creole, mixed, and English. The English spoken in Guyana shares many linkages with the earlier vernacular Englishes that were brought to Guyana by the British over a period of 300 years. And the British who came from various social backgrounds. My study, which I'm going to talk about, investigated variation and change in the use of a preverbal auxiliary derived from English periphrastic do. The auxiliary has multiple variants, which are the result of a series of ongoing changes. These changes are further moving Guyanese English away from the present Western Englishes. Additionally, the study explored the social meaning of variation and the validity of standardness. It conducted a series of match-guise tests which suggest confusion in the minds of speakers in unambiguously labeling the variants as English, Creole, or mixed. Further, auxiliary variants are evaluated neutrally without attaching greater or lesser value or prestige despite an ongoing change at an advanced stage at that time. Excuse me. A total of 13 stimuli representing spontaneous speech were extracted from the social linguistic interviews from 5 different speakers. Spontaneous speech was used to maintain naturalness and authenticity of vernacular. Each of these, the speech units, each of the speech stimulus contained the test variant, which included the individual variants of does, such as does, z, is, but also verbal s, zero, and a. I'm not going to go into the details or examples of these. The test sentences were selected in such a way that the same variants were produced by different speakers, and the same speakers produced different variants in different sentences. This provided the needed guise and also help in avoiding speaker bias. For example, different sentences produced by the same speaker were rated differently. The first test comprised all the 13 test stimuli. As no prior information was available on occupational ranking in Guyana, locally relevant 10 occupations were selected, keeping in view the overall levels of education and the local socioeconomic structure. The listeners were presented with a choice of 10 occupational categories and were asked to assign each speaker, that means speech stimulus, to one of the 10 suitable occupations instead of asking them to rank each choice on a scale. The choices exercised by the respondents should allow us to infer the social ranking, if any, associated with the habitual variance. The results suggest that the respondents failed to distinguish among different variants as they could not unambiguously assign them to a given occupational category. The responses for each variant are widely distributed across the 10 choices. A majority of the variants are concentrated in the middle level ranking occupations, followed by the lower or the higher ones. None of the variants received recognizably highest occupational rankings, though Z overall seems to have lower rankings than does also has its share of low rankings. Moreover, it fails to explain the overall low rankings of more English-like variants. The findings seem to suggest that the variants are used across social spectrum and do not index one's socioeconomic status. On a second test, listeners were asked to judge each speech excerpt for 5 attributes: language variety, which included standard English, Creole, and mix. These labels were supplied to them. Social class, namely upper middle class, lower middle class, and working class. Education level, primary, secondary, university. Ethnicity, such as East Indian, Negro, this is the term that was used in Guyana, and residence, such as town versus country. The stimuli were randomly ordered. The 35 listeners were all university students, but many of them were employed as teachers in school, and a few of them were involved in other occupations. They were mostly in the age group of 16 to 35 years, a couple of them in their early 40s. They were a multiracial group comprising Indo-Guyanese, Afro-Guyanese, and racially mixed. However, these personal traits have no effect on the results. The results for socioeconomic class and level of education also paint a similar picture. There is no evidence that the different variants are aligned along the socioeconomic hierarchy in any straightforward manner. There is also no clear differentiation among the variants in terms of educational background of speakers. Therefore, the variants do not index level of education either. The findings also suggest confusion in the minds of speakers in unambiguously labeling the variants as English, Creole, or mixed. On average, the variants are more mixed than Creole, providing evidence against the utility of the concept of standardness as well as Creole continuum. Findings of various subjective reaction tests unequivocally fail to reveal any clear associations between the various variants and their possible social meanings in ways that we are used to seeing in studies on English in Western context. However, an interesting observation that does emerge from the findings is the broadening of the vernacular. That is, the so-called mixed and Creole varieties together refer to 2 layers with distinct labels, though, of one broad variety and not necessarily 2 or more distinct varieties, as much of the early Creole literature would like us to believe. The Creole mixed and mixed together represent the vernacular and therefore non-standard in the broader sense, but something that is not devalued and may not even warrant the label non-standard. The variation in Guyanese, then, can be best understood in terms of a division not between English and Creole, but between standard and vernacular, mix of Creole, which is in greater consonance with the variation studies elsewhere. However, as I just mentioned, the relationship between the two is not the same as in the Western context. This is because the hierarchical evaluation on prestige ranking is absent. This constitutes an important difference. I now consider additional pieces of independent evidence to show why the findings are different in the case of English in Guyana, or what produces such a difference. On yet another task, using Gutman scaling, 37 respondents were asked to rate the 3 varieties for 5 qualities: sweet, musical, intimate, refined, prestigious, formal, each on a scale of 1 to 5, lowest to highest. Every time we conduct subjective reaction tests, it's actually recommended that we also conduct a similar test, which is reported here, to see the emotional value that speakers attach to a particular variety. Both Creole and mixed were rated highly musical, intimate, and sweet. In contrast, standard ranked very high on the other 3 qualities, which included refined, prestigious, and formal. The first 3 values can be taken to indicate a feeling of warmth. The next 3 values are more suggestive of distance and formality. Both Creole and mixed were rated highly on the first 3 qualities, whereas the standard received higher ranking for the last 3 qualities. This finding is in consonance with the reported style shift, meta-linguistic commentaries, and with findings, not all of which are shown here, that standard is the choice with foreigners, outsiders, and in specific context. Despite respondents' ranking the label standard highly on a prestige scale and refinedness, these do not translate into other expected social attributes. For example, none of the habitual variants, including the one at an advanced stage of change, were judged as standard. That none of the variants received extreme rankings on any of the parameters suggests absence of prestige or stigma attached to, absence of prestige or stigma attached to any of the variants. All in all, ratings appear to be neutral. The responses on Gutman scale and domain analysis point towards a convergence in values and functions that Creole and mixed together serve as our tongue, a language that evokes we feelings, localness, and positive emotional values such as melodious, sweet, and intimacy. One second. All right. Thus, an additional horizontal parameters that emerge from this study is the us versus them dimension, which is different from high and low. So here you could see the figures. This is the one that we talked about, the Gutman scaling, ranking on various qualities such as sweet, musical, intimate. And this is the occupational ranking, levels of education, Creole mixed standard, and the social ranking of variants. So you could see that the rankings they don't go linearly in one direction or the other, but every variant received multiple rankings. Another survey carried out in Jamaica suggests similar results. Jamaican English has long been described as comprising a continuum of English varieties, ranging from English-like to those maximally unlike modern Western Standard English, which is called Patois. This is one of the largest surveys that was carried out in Jamaica to test attitudes towards the local vernacular and English by recruiting as many as 1,000 respondents from across Jamaica, representing 3 age groups, gender, and demography. The test comprised a number of questionnaires to elicit language use and attributes of the speakers of Patois and English. One of the salient findings is that an overwhelming percentage of respondents reported use of both the varieties across age groups, gender, in both rural and urban settings, across occupational backgrounds, and from across Jamaica. Use of both English and Patois are on the rise among the younger speakers, suggesting a further increase in positive orientation towards Patois. Very little English is used in family settings, and English is the choice with strangers. The results are overwhelmingly the same, regardless of the respondents' demography, age, and gender. Respondents also thought that those who speak English are more educated than those who speak Patwa. However, a majority of the respondents thought that an English and Patwa school would be better for their children than an English medium school alone. Overall, the survey finds overwhelmingly positive attitudes towards Patwas, so much so that respondents are favorable to declaring Patwa as an official language. So, summing it up, over the years, social linguistics research has consistently produced a set of findings which are not in consonance with the social linguistic realities outside the West. The findings relate to the relationship between quantitative variation and its social and stylistic stratification, which can be interpreted by invoking notions of standardness, the associated prestige that a standard enjoys, and which in turn confers certain positive or negative attributes to the linguistic variants. Several studies fail to replicate similar findings in the case of English in non-Western context, such as India and Guyana, and also elsewhere. The reasons are attributed to the absence of a monocultural national ideology of the West that underlies the construction of modern European nation states. Such an ideology subordinates and marginalizes the local diversity in Western settings, producing the kind of findings with reference to standardness and social meaning. Multicultural ideologies, in contrast, produce horizontal relations among diversity. While terms standard and non-standard might be used everywhere, these do not invoke the similar attitudes or relationships as seen in more widely studied Western societies. There's a lot more to parameters, and each one requires lengthy discussion. For now, a takeaway from today's talk is to interrogate the Western models, especially some of the parameters, which we so readily embrace. Another takeaway is that a new terminology, which may appear novel, needs to be proved before adopting it as a fashion term or a new idea. Finally, multicultural societies need to be handled with caution, and one has to be mindful of the consequences of the methods and approaches followed. I would end this talk with this slide. I think there's less than a minute and it might just lock us out, but never mind, we log back in again because there might be questions, right? So I would end with this slide, which okay, I guess you can see this slide. So this is the last slide that I put together because there was a question last time, but I'm not elaborating on this. So this slide essentially reads, social value of a parameter does not pre-exist, nor does the language necessarily index one or all of them. Though I focused only on standardness, but standardness in itself entails many of the other traits. So I have listed here, people are joining. So you could see a lot of traits are listed here on the left side, like standardness, social class, occupation, education, caste, land, religion, region, gender, rural, urban, age, and what have you. But I've also listed on the other side, nation, region, sub-region, affiliation, affiliations or traits born with, acquired, achieved, given by others, self-believed, etc., right? So the message here is that everyone has simultaneously multiple identities, starting from the family, belonging, place, biological traits, achieved traits, beliefs, etc. But identities are contextually construed. And it doesn't mean that language will necessarily index them. Language need not index them, right? Or language may index them differently in different places, different speech communities. So just a last example, Bhutan Nepali refugees living in the United States consider themselves as Nepali by language, but also as Bhutanese. Despite having lived in Nepal refugee camps, they acknowledge that they speak Nepali, but they're also aware that they speak a different Nepali. Another ethno-linguistic survey carried out, I think in Nubra Valley, which is home to Sherpas, non-Nepali speaking communities, they consider themselves as Bhutia. So the caption goes like this: ethnically Bhutia, but Nepali by nationalism, right? So the various identities can actually coexist. And that's an interesting finding because given the history of the conflict that Nepal has seen, and the language activism and the rise in the ethno-linguistic identities, where languages went on multiplying by every census year, and the number of Nepali speakers were conversely coming down. Okay, so I stop here, and thank you very much for coming to the talk. And now it's open for any questions, comments, observations that you may have.
Yeah, good afternoon, ma'am. Just a couple of questions in regards to the standardization also. I'm very sorry. The last time I missed the session, but the previous one I had it. But yeah, I'm myself. I'm a social linguistic researcher in India, part of an NGO. So especially considering the standard, especially the standardness of language. So we have even the examples that brought here. It's not really tested in a diversified situations where we have more, like if you talk about India, we have more of pidgin creolized situation, language in more in contact. So the diversity will be more in terms of taking for example, English as an example and having the result and testing and all. And I can give you one example, like even in India, we have Nagamis in Northeast as a, we can say as a, it started as a pidgin, but the creolization was there, then it became a Creola because the generation started to speak that Nagamis as a mother tongue. So it became a Creola then. So pidgin and Creola, nowadays it's increasing more because of the language contacts between tribals, between small lingua franca situations or existing in India. So even when we talk about standardness, so what exactly are we bringing a criteria to make it? Only from a linguistic perspective or from a social linguistic perspective? Because if linguistic alone, it wouldn't make a sense in 100% to make sure that that language standardness is so and so. But if we consider social linguistic aspect, then it would be great, I think. So I would like to hear from your comments regarding this.
Thank you for your comment and observation. See, I'm talking, whatever I've been talking here, I'm talking from social linguistics point of view. That means I'm going into the research that is being produced now beyond the West, which has brought in a lot of newer findings and newer insights, because the speech communities and the societies are not the same across the globe, right? That's one. Now, the reason I chose to talk about standardness is that if you look at the history of the Western social linguistics, this is not to blame them, but standardness is an important concept that shows up. Every time we talk about language variation and change, every variant is identified as either standard or non-standard. And when you do their social evaluation, so the entire theory, for example, which is about attention paid to speech, the style shift, or the social meaning, basically. So I was trying to say what produces those social meanings in the Western context, but fails to produce the same elsewhere. So whether it is English, whether it is Nagamis or anything, I wouldn't use the term pigeons and creoles, as I just mentioned, or even the word tribe, because they have been given to us and they are heavily loaded terms. So Nagamis is a highly vibrant language. I myself have been that's one area of my research, and I think I discussed that example in detail in one of the talks. So the reason I brought up this issue is that there are all kinds of people who do research with the community. Not necessarily everybody does the kind of social linguistics or the mainstream social linguistics, but they do a whole lot of applied kind of research. So this was a caution that when you're dealing with languages, don't unnecessarily judge the relations between languages. For example, you mentioned Nagamese. So there is no reason to mention that Nagamese carries low prestige. Yes, it does. Some people take it as a threat to the existence of other languages. But the point is that when you compare Nagamese, which has no official recognition, and compare it with English, which is the state official language, that English has very limited use. It's not of socially much consequence. What you hear every day around in public domains is Nagamese. It carries the maximum functional load. So it is meaningless to talk about them in terms of high and low. And when we extend your question, let's say, to another setting in Nagaland, let's say the Aos, where it is often said by people, Chungli is the written language, so Mungsan is dying out. But if you actually conduct a research, right, empirical research, you actually show that is not the case at all. So this is the caution that I'm here advising people to be very, very careful instead of judging the varieties by the terms that have been supplied to us, because we don't understand them, in the sense that we have a book definitions, but definitions are a problem. You know, when the definitions multiply, that means understanding is missing somewhere. So we need to understand those concepts, we need to interrogate them, and then see whether we really need. That way, every language has a history of contact. So it doesn't serve any purpose by denigrating them, by calling them pigeon or something. So it's not a process. I mean, I think enough research on the so-called Creole communities have shown that there is no relationship between a Pidgin Creole and a D Creole trio. So the migrants who arrived as adults, children did not learn the local English from them, but rather they learned it from the environment. Right? So it is wrong to imagine a link between what the parents spoke and what the children spoke. So these are processes which go on simultaneously with different age groups responding to it differently. Right? Did I answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Almost. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Adding on to this, the other question is like, do we have a certain when we say the word standardness, do we have certain criteria for looking into each language? For example, the context where I'm talking is, if we go to a tribal language and if we do a social linguistic survey among the tribal language, and there will be probably there will be multiple dialects within them. So they might not know, as you know, that they might not know what is standard dialect within them, but they might probably know prestigious kind of a dialect within them, maybe a reference dialect, which could be considered as a standard, maybe from their own point of view that I'm talking about. So if we talk about a tribal language and doing a research in that, and they have maybe say 4 to 5 dialects within them, and one dialect they consider as a reference dialect or a prestigious dialect based on certain things. For example, history can be a major reason for considering that. Maybe religion can be a major reason considering that, or else even the caste can be a reason why the dialect is chosen as the standard one. So when we as a linguist talk about dialect standardness of a language, what exactly are we looking into?
I think my whole talk has addressed this issue by saying standardness, after all, is not a very useful concept to extend it to the multicultural societies. I talked about so many criteria, right, that one can take, like writing, literary canon, but none of these criteria work. What I was trying to say here is that the whole idea of standardness, even the notion of language versus dialect, they are an outcome of the Language and Nation project, going back to the 19th century. The modern European nation states, which started coming up and followed a formula of one language, one race, one population. It is here that the powerful normative standards that emerged, they became the languages, and everything else was reduced to dialectal diversity. So it's of no consequence. People, it may mean different things to different people. It may mean that they have every tier, there is this sort of regional level lingua franca. So in Nagaland, where Angamis live in about more than 100 villages, right? So across villages, when they talk, despite they're speaking in largely mutually intelligible varieties, they may consider one village speech as the common one. That's the term I've heard. They don't say standard, they say the common one. So Kohima village variety is considered as the common one, right? And this is how the diversity is organized in multiple layers, right? So what holds diversity together is always availability of some shared language practices. But assumptions and thinking, I mean, it's of no use, whichever context you're talking about. If you take language in space and in time, we would expect to find a lot of diversity there, right? And since nothing has been done, no prior works exist on that, all you're doing is, in fact, knowing this is useful, that you should know that what you are describing is valid for a particular slice of space. And the kind of age group that you are taking, that it is only confined to a particular age group, and it doesn't necessarily represent the entirety. So this is where people go wrong. For example, so a lot of people do such kind of processing or comprehension task, etc., etc. But if their empirical database is poor, they will end up making erroneous comments about the nature of ergativity in Punjabi. So you cannot say flatly that Punjabi has it or Punjabi doesn't have ergativity. If you go in space across the region where Punjabi is spoken, you will find both kinds. Right? So this is what I was trying to say. I would suggest that you can read some of the articles. And in order to learn social linguistics, I'm sorry, but one has to unlearn many of the things, because there are popular notions that have been given to us through very prescriptive models of seeing, of understanding language. And we, unfortunately, when we teach through the books without training, we tend to perpetuate those definitions without understanding. So this is the caution that I have from me.
Thanks, ma'am. That actually helps a lot to people also. Yeah.
Any other observations and comments, please?
So anyway, I'm Panicure. Parameters are concerned, as Shobha you have correctly pointed out, that all these Western types of parameters which they have put forward need not necessarily applicable to the Indian situation, or rather the South Asian situation. For example, she has pointed out that high and low, which is not applicable in India. Anyway, I don't know the other parts of India as far as Kerala is concerned. Malayalam language is concerned. Professor Shobha Satyanath is absolutely correct. Since based on the social class, naturally the Brahmins, that means Kerala Brahmins, we call Nambudris. All the communities, all of us respect Nambudris. There is no doubt regarding it. Even today, in the modern society also, we have some respect, to Nambudris. But when we come to the language of the Nambudris, that is our Brahmin language, was never considered to be a prestigious one, even in the ancient times or even today. Even though many of the literary men are from the Nambudiri communities. So another point she has stated that is also quite valid as far as Malayalam is concerned. That is, she has pointed out classical literary variety need not be same as the standard variety. So naturally, we can have a tripartite division there. The classical literary variety for Malayalam, which is highly Sanskritized one, which are not used as standard variety. Then we have other variety as standard, which is not the classical type of literary variety, which is used for only literary purposes. And even that this present day standard variety is used in when a professor takes a class in a classroom, he uses standard variety and not the literary variety. And similarly, in public meetings, there also this standard variety is. And nowadays, even in writing, this standard variety is used, and that is different from this classical literary variety. So naturally, we can have three or tripartite division as classical literary variety, standard variety, and a non-standard dialect varieties. And another point which she has pointed out, there among the criteria, that is, she didn't explain it, but I am putting it from the Kerala experience. That is, one of the criteria among these parameters, religion is found. And in the Indian context, that religion plays a very significant part. Whether the affiliation, whether the religious affiliation or religion or the linguistic affiliation, there is in some areas we have conflicts. What I mean is, in some areas, let it be the Idukki district of Kerala. We have Tamil population, Kerala, Malayalam. Let it be Palakkad district. We have a Tamil population and Malayalam population. There naturally the Malayalam people have, speaking people have more affiliation or affinity amongst themselves. And similarly, the Tamil people amongst themselves, the affinity. But same is the case for Palakkad and Idukki and even in our southern Travancore region. But when we come to Kasaragod district, you can see a peculiar thing. What I mean is north of Kasaragod town, the Malayalam population is there. There, at least more than 1/3 people are Malayalam mother tongue people. We have many Malayalam speaking people, but many language speaking people, mainly 3 categories. One is Tulu, that is the more in number, and then Malayalam, and then Kannada. These 3 major groups, in addition to Marathi and all. So among this, what we can see is north of Karnataka, predominant community which speaks Malayalam is the Muslim community. We have Malayalam speaking Hindus and Christians and all. But what happens is, since it so happened that large majority of the Malayalam speaking people are Muslims, the Malayalam language is identified as a Muslim language in that region. And because as a consequence of it, what happens is the minor communities, there are a few minor communities who speak Malayalam. They do not identify themselves as Malayalis. In their census report or when they were there, declare themselves as their mother tongue as either Kannada or Tulu, not Malayalam. And here what happens is they give more importance to religion or more affinity as far as they are concerned is towards religion rather than to Malayalam. But in other areas, what we see is that particular the language affinity is more than the religious affinity. I don't know whether it is right or wrong. I heard it when the division of Punjab and Haryana has taken place. A mother tongue survey had been done, and there I am not sure, that is only told to me. Many of the Hindus of that region, Punjabi mother tongue Hindus, declared themselves as their mother tongue as Hindi rather than Punjabi. And when that population based on Hindi people, more Hindi people speaking residents, people are residents. That is to be bifurcated as Haryana, and the Punjabi mother tongue group, that area is to be divided as in that way. At that particular period of time, it is heard, I am not sure. So that means in certain contexts, religious comes or becomes more forceful than this our language identity. Anyway, one thing based on that, why I cited this one is only for based on Professor Shobha Satyanath's statement there she has correctly stated, even though all these parameters are there, they cannot be uniformly applied. There will be variations, and that can be based on the situations. All these parameters which are need not be operative in one place and may not be correct in an area. Maybe 2 or 3 parameters may be right as far as Malayalam is concerned. Or even in a Malayalam area, there may be the regional vary, and same may not be applicable in other areas. Another point which I would like to know is that difference in standard English, etc., of the pronunciation of Indians. There, what happens in the North Indian, I mean Northern Delhi, and like that she has taken, and the regions, there are variations, etc. She has pointed. Whether it is due to the social class variation, or actually the variation of the teachers who taught in the nursery schools or in convent schools, English medium schools like that. That means these people whose mother tongue is not English, we have acquired that language in their variation schools or variation of teachers from the nursery onwards. That plays a significant part. Why I say is, my son was admitted here in a nursery school near to university campus. At that time, what happens is, for 1 year in the lower KG, actually there was a British lady, that is a nun. She was teaching English, of course. And then after that 1 year, she has gone to Goa also. But then actually our Indian sister came. So difference was very much. So naturally in these convent schools educated, English education, whether these parameters cannot be, I mean, may not be, I am not sure Shobha has done such work of that, I am not sure about. May not be because of this, maybe the most influential factor will be the teachers who teach this language to the students. And that is one thing. And another doubt which I have is regarding that Guyana situation, where we have that Patwa and English. Whether this Patwa is clearized, where English cannot consider it as a variety of English itself, this Patwa, since it is a realization of English, it's not so. And then that actual English, if majority of the people speak Patwa, naturally we have to recognize it as a language itself, and more affinity we can, or we naturally, if that is their common variety of speech, we have to expect the Guyana people have more they identify their language as Patwa rather than English. That also possibilities also. I am not sure about the difference between actual Patwa and English. Of course, English probably British English, and this may be a variety of type of English. That's all right. Thank you very much. It is a very, very informative speech, and what we agree with most of the points which was illustrated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Panikkar, for bringing up so much of from your vast experience and rightly pointing out so many other issues that I have not touched upon. So I'll take one of the things that you've said, what produces different Englishes, right? Whether in India or elsewhere. So you mentioned one, whether it is whether convent educated speak alike and whether teacher plays an important role or not. Okay. So these schools, some schools may have a lot of drilling where they actually drill students and say, pronounce it like this. But the interesting thing is that the studies that I have quoted and the other research on English that we have done in Delhi, the school background did not matter. They all participate in the variations. For example, vowels are undergoing a lot of changes in Delhi today. So earlier we had a split of North and Goat, where many of the goat north vowels were also pronounced as goat. So we said board, court. But now increasingly we are hearing board, cord, airport, where people are lowering those vowels, right? And it's very interesting that you find them happening everywhere, regardless of one's education background. But more interesting for us is the observation that these changes are coming essentially from those who had government medium vernacular medium education, not the English medium education. And in one of the schools, the school management compiled a book of pronunciations. So they had listed a lot of words, how to pronounce. And for many words, they had listed more than one pronunciation there, right? So I think to understand what produces what where, we need to go into the history of that community and how English grew over a period of time and what's going on. You're absolutely right. Though we use the terms like Patwa, Creole, etc., these are the terms given by the others, not by the speakers themselves. They only mean a particular ways of speaking or a variety of English. So I just call them vernacular. You're absolutely. I'm not in favor of using these terms, whether you call it Patwa or you call it Pidgins and Creole. These are like othering the speakers of other Englishes. This is I call othering, so that they say the normative English is the authentic one, is the purer one. But the fact is that any language that moves, it also multiplies. So colonization moved Englishes everywhere, globalized it, but it also multiplied Englishes. And it produced very, very divergent varieties of English, which are not without grammar. They have their own systems. Like one example that we took for S voicing, that we take it for granted. Children are drilled in school, so they know what they have to pronounce, and yet they actually don't, right? Some of the other examples, if we draw a distinction between Dravid, some of them may have something to do with the local linguistic ecologies, rather than simply school teachers drilling or a straight form of transfer from one language to the other. But what happens is that it is basically a contact between two systems and not the surface forms. So we saw in the case of Nagamis also. So what has produced those changes is, for example, so every change has a trigger somewhere else. So we saw there's a neutralization of number difference in the pronominal morphology, but that change is triggered by the differences that exist in the number morphology of the two languages. It is that which has triggered it, and because of that, it has led to other forms. Right. So that's why language contact becomes very important. It's not simply convergence or divergence, but trying to understand how grammars undergo changes. Now, you brought up some very interesting observations about religion. I would only say that we have to see under what circumstances and when religion becomes an important factor, which makes people identify themselves one way or the other. So in the case of Delhi, we know 1984 Sikh riots was a turning factor, a major turning factor, and the use of Hindi increased in the Punjabi households after that. Otherwise, you would have found before that Punjabi was spoken in every household. So a lot of things have happened which affect the psyche. And similarly, when we talk about Kerala, which is and go to the coast area, we have to see when does Islam arrives, when are people converted, and what kind of communities adopted this religion and came into the fold. What kind of were they artisans? Were they pathetic communities? What is it that they were doing? So Mahapalas, for example, right? So we have lots and lots of communities with a variety of different cultural practices. I think they all translate into understanding what they are. This is what I was trying to say. But thank you so much for your enlightening observations and comments.
Thank you very much.
On behalf of ISDL, I express my sincere thanks to Professor Shobha Satyanath for delivering lecture on parameters of variation. It was such an informative lecture regarding standard, non-standard languages, diglossia, and stagnantness, etc. Thank you, ma'am. I also extend thanks to all the participants who joined us today through both online and offline mode. We will continue this lecture series on social linguistics on next Tuesday on 27th February. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much to the audience who took time out to hear me, and to the DLA for taking the responsibility for organizing. Thank you so much.